Life at sea was tough for pirates, but an empty stomach was their deadliest enemy. While movies showed them fighting with swords and cannons, their real battle was against rotting food and empty barrels. These sea-hardened sailors had to master some pretty creative ways to keep their food fresh, or at least edible, during months-long voyages. And it all started with something we take for granted today: salt. Well, for pirates, salt wasn't just something that made their hair crusty. It was their ticket to not starving at sea. While modern sailors can pack their ships with freezers full of food, pirates had to get creative with keeping their meals from turning bad. Salt was the superstar of food preservation on pirate ships, and they needed tons of it. A single barrel of salted beef could contain more salt than a pirate's yearly intake, which is saying something, considering how much salt they probably consumed just by accidentally swallowing seawater during storms. The process was pretty straightforward. They'd coat chunks of meat or fish with thick layers of salt, which pulled out the moisture faster than a thirsty sailor emptying his rum ration. It gets interesting and kind of gross when the salt didn't just preserve the meat, it transformed it into something that looked more like a ship's plank than dinner. The meat would become so hard and salty that eating it straight up would be like trying to chew on your leather boots. Probably tastier, though, depending on where you'd been walking. Pirates had to soak these salt-cured meats in fresh water for hours, sometimes even days, before they could even think about cooking them. One fascinating detail that often gets overlooked is just how heavy these barrels of salted meat were. A standard barrel of salted beef could weigh more than 400 pounds. That's about the weight of 2 adult pirates. Imagine trying to move that around during a storm while also trying not to fall overboard. The salt preservation method wasn't perfect, though. Sometimes, despite their best efforts, the meat would still go bad. You could usually tell by the smell. If it made your eyes water more than chopping onions, it was probably time to feed it to the fish. Pirates developed a clever test. They'd stick a knife deep into the meat, pull it out, and give it a good sniff. If the knife came out smelling like your grandmother's cellar after a flood, that meat was destined for the deep blue. What's really wild is that some pirates became incredibly skilled at salting different types of meat. They learned through trial and error that different meats needed different amounts of salt. Fish needed less salt than beef, and smaller cuts needed less time in the salt than bigger ones. The most surprising thing about this whole salting business, it actually worked pretty well most of the time. Sure, it wasn't going to win any culinary awards, but it kept pirates fed during long voyages when fresh food was as rare as an honest merchant. A well-salted barrel of meat could last for months, sometimes even up to a year if they got the process just right and stored it in a cool, dry part of the ship. But salt wasn't just used for preserving meat. Pirates also discovered that salt could preserve vegetables, albeit with mixed results. Cabbage, for instance, took particularly well to salting. But when salt supplies ran low, as they often did during long voyages, pirates had to look somewhere else for their next preservation solution, and that method came from nature itself, the relentless Caribbean sun. Sun-drying was probably discovered by some hungry pirate who left their fish out too long and realized it hadn't gone bad. From there, it became a regular practice that saved many crew from going hungry during long voyages. The process was deceptively simple, but getting it right was trickier. Pirates would slice their meat or fish into thin strips, much like making jerky today. These strips would be laid out on clean canvas or wooden racks on the deck, preferably on days when the sun was beating down harder than a first mate's drum during battle stations. But it gets interesting when the pirates had to become amateur meteorologists to make this work. They learned to read the skies better than any weather app we have today. A sudden rainstorm could ruin days of drying progress, turning their precious food into a moldy mess faster than you could say, walk the plank. Some clever crews developed makeshift covers they could quickly throw over their drying racks when storm clouds appeared on the horizon. The biggest pain in their wooden legs wasn't actually the weather, it was the local wildlife. Seagulls turned these drying sessions into all-you-can-eat buffets. Pirates had to post lookouts not just for enemy ships, but for these feathered thieves too. In the scorching heat of the Caribbean, meat could dry in just a few days, but sail too far north and you might as well be trying to dry meat in a fog bank. Pirates operating in warmer waters definitely had an advantage here. One reason why so many of them chose to prowl the Caribbean rather than the chilly North Atlantic. In particularly dry climates, sun-dried food could last for an incredibly long time. There are documented cases of pirates finding perfectly preserved dried fish in abandoned native settlements that had been there for months. This discovery led many crews to start experimenting with different drying techniques they learned from local populations. One method involved using the ship's rigging to their advantage. Some pirates would string up their meat strips high in the ropes where they'd catch both sun and wind. This technique dried the food faster and kept it away from deck-bound pests, though it did make the ship look like it was flying some very unusual flags. The success rate of sun drying varied wildly. In perfect conditions, about 80% of the meat would dry properly. But throw in some humid days or a surprise shower, and that number could drop faster than an anchor in shallow water. Pirates learned to hedge their bets by drying smaller batches more frequently, rather than risking their entire food supply on one big drying session. Another unexpected benefit of sun drying was that it made the food lighter and easier to store. 100 pounds of fresh meat might dry down to just 20 pounds, while keeping most of its nutritional value. For ships where space was more precious than a chest of gold, this was a huge advantage. While sun drying helped keep many pirates fed, they couldn't always count on good weather to preserve their food. That's when they turned to another method that didn't require depending on Mother Nature's mood. Pirates actually dedicated a surprising amount of energy to pickling things. Pretty much anything that could fit in a barrel became fair game for preservation in brine or vinegar. It wasn't just about keeping food from spoiling, it was about staying alive at sea. The interesting part about pirate pickling was how it accidentally saved countless lives. Back then, sailors were dropping like flies from scurvy, a nasty disease caused by not getting enough vitamin C. Historical records show that scurvy killed more sailors than all sea battles, storms, and accidents combined. We're talking about nearly 2 million sailors between the 15th and 18th centuries. But those pickle-loving pirates, they were accidentally protecting themselves by chomping down on pickled vegetables that still retained some vitamin C. Pirates learned the pickling trade through a mix of trial, error, and probably more than a few upset stomachs. They'd pack barrels with vegetables, pour in a mixture of vinegar, salt, and sometimes spices, then seal it all up tight. The real trick was getting the mix right. Too little vinegar and you'd end up with a barrel of mush that could knock out a seagull at 20 paces. The variety of things pirates pickled would surprise most people. Cabbage was a favorite, turning into something like sauerkraut over time. But they also pickled onions, carrots, and even meat when they had to. Vinegar became so valuable on pirate ships that it was sometimes worth its weight in silver. It wasn't just for pickling. Pirates used it for everything. Got a dirty barrel? Splash some vinegar in it. Bad smells below deck? Vinegar. Feeling sick? Take a swig of vinegar. Some pirates even believed it could ward off evil spirits, though that might have had more to do with its strong smell than any supernatural properties. The most clever pirates figured out how to make their own vinegar at sea. They'd save bits of wine or cider that had gone bad, add some water, and let it ferment further into vinegar. This was a big deal because running out of vinegar meant no more pickling, and no more pickling meant taking your chances with scurvy. Storage was another challenge. Pickled foods had to be kept in cool, dark places to last as long as possible. This usually meant storing them in the ship's hold, where they competed for space with other supplies, treasure, and sometimes even gunpowder. Pirates had to be careful about barrel placement too. One leaky pickle barrel could start a chain reaction of spoilage that would make the whole hold smell like a seasick mermaid. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of pirate pickling was how it influenced ship politics. The ship's cook, who usually oversaw the pickling process, became one of the most important people on board. After all, they were the ones who knew how to keep the food edible and the crew healthy. There are stories of pirate cooks being paid extra shares of treasure just because they were particularly good at pickling. The preservation knowledge these pirates developed wasn't just about survival. It became part of their legacy. Many of their pickling techniques spread to coastal communities where they made port, and some of these methods are still used today. The next time you bite into a pickle, you're tasting a bit of pirate history. But when vinegar was scarce, that's when they turned to an even older method. The art of smoking food came naturally to pirates. After all, they were pretty good at creating smoke signals when they raided coastal towns. But smoking food was a bit trickier than just setting things on fire. It required patience, skill, and most importantly, a safe place to do it that wouldn't accidentally turn their wooden ship into the world's largest torch. Pirates typically did their smoking on shore during their stops for supplies. They'd build special smoking racks using whatever materials they could find, usually a combination of green wood for the frame and drier wood for the smoke. The trick was getting the temperature just right. Too hot, and you'd end up with charcoal. Too cool, and you'd just have raw meat covered in a smoke smell. Here's something that might surprise you. Different woods gave the food different flavors, and pirates became unexpectedly picky about their smoking wood. Pirates refused to use pine wood for smoking because it made the meat taste like a mouthful of ship's tar. Instead, they preferred hardwoods like oak or fruit woods when they could get them. Some crews would even store special smoking wood alongside their other supplies, taking up precious cargo space that could have been used for loot. The smoking process itself was fascinating. First, they'd prepare the meat or fish by cutting it into strips and rubbing it with salt. Then, they'd hang these strips on racks above a very low fire, making sure the smoke could circulate around each piece. The real magic happened over the next 24 to 48 hours. The smoke would slowly penetrate the food, depositing tiny particles that not only added flavor, but also helped preserve the meat by creating a protective outer layer. One of the most remarkable aspects of pirate smoking techniques was how they learned from local communities. Caribbean natives had been smoking food for generations, and some pirate crews picked up advanced techniques from them. For instance, they learned that smoking fish with certain local aromatic woods could make it last twice as long as regular smoking. The success rate of smoking varied wildly depending on conditions. In good weather with the right wood and enough time, about 70% of the meat would preserve well enough to last several months. However, rushing the process or smoking in humid conditions could result in food that spoils within weeks. Pirates learned to smoke extra food during ideal conditions, creating a surplus for times when smoking wasn't possible. Fire safety was a huge concern. You can probably guess why having fire around a wooden ship filled with gunpowder might be problematic. Most crews had strict rules about smoking food on board. One rule from 1723 specified that anyone caught smoking meat on board without the captain's permission would be marooned on the next island they found. Harsh, but considering they were trying to prevent the ship from burning down, maybe fair enough. The amount of food pirates could smoke at once was pretty impressive. A good-sized smoking rack could handle up to 200 pounds of meat or fish at a time. Some crews got really organized about it, setting up smoking shifts so they could keep the process going day and night when they were in a safe harbor. The smoke also had an unexpected benefit. It kept mosquitoes and other insects away from their coastal camps. But what about those times when pirates couldn't make it to shore or when the weather was too wet for smoking? That's when they turned to another preservation method. Everyone knows pirates loved their rum, but what most people don't realize is that alcohol played a much bigger role on pirate ships than just keeping the crew happy. It was actually one of their most effective food preservation methods. Though explaining that to the captain when caught drinking, the preservative probably didn't go over too well. Pirates discovered that alcohol, particularly rum and brandy, was incredible at keeping food from spoiling. They'd store fruits in barrels of rum, creating what was essentially the world's first fruit cocktail, though probably not one you'd want to order at a modern bar. The alcohol killed harmful bacteria and prevented rot, while also infusing the fruit with flavors that made hardtack somewhat more bearable to eat. The numbers around alcohol preservation are pretty eye-opening. A standard pirate ship in the 1700s would carry around 6,000 gallons of rum, not just for drinking, but largely for preservation. That's enough to fill a small swimming pool. Each crew member's official rum ration was about half a pint per day, leaving plenty for food preservation. Of course, keeping the crew from sampling the preservation liquid was another challenge entirely. One of the most interesting preservation techniques involved citrus fruits. Pirates would pack lemons, limes, and oranges in brandy. A single barrel of brandy-preserved citrus could keep a crew of 50 healthy for about 2 months, assuming they didn't drink it all first. The preservation process itself was pretty straightforward. They'd fill barrels with alternating layers of fruit and alcohol, seal them tight, and store them in the coolest part of the ship. The real trick was getting the ratio right. Too much alcohol would turn the fruit into boozy mush, while too little wouldn't preserve it properly. Through trial and error, pirates figured out that a ratio of about 3 parts alcohol to 1 part fruit worked best. But it wasn't just fruit that got the alcohol treatment. Meat preserved in brandy was a delicacy on some ships. The alcohol would keep the meat from spoiling while also tenderizing it. though it did tend to make dinner time a bit more interesting than usual. A pirate crew that was particularly fond of brandy-preserved pork, noting that the men seemed exceedingly merry at their evening meal. The alcohol preservation method had another unexpected benefit. It made the food more compact. Fruits would shrink as they soaked in the alcohol, allowing pirates to store more in a single barrel. This was crucial given the limited space on ships. A barrel of alcohol-preserved fruit could last up to a year if stored properly, though finding a barrel that hadn't been sampled after a year was about as rare as finding an honest tax collector. The cooler parts of the ship, usually near the waterline, were prime real estate for alcohol-preserved foods. Pirates learned that every 10-degree increase in temperature could cut the preservation time in half. This led to some creative storage solutions, including the practice of keeping preserved food barrels wrapped in wet cloth to promote cooling through evaporation. While alcohol was a fantastic preservative, it did have its limitations. For one thing, it was expensive. Using alcohol for preservation meant less for drinking and trading. Some pirates turned to another preservation method that was even more effective. Long before protein bars and trail mix, pirates had their own version of survival food: pemmican. It wasn't pretty, it didn't smell great, and it definitely wouldn't win any culinary awards, but this dense blob of ground meat and fat kept many a pirate alive during long voyages when other food stores ran low. The story of how pirates discovered pemmican is a testament to their resourcefulness. During their raids along the North American coastline, they encountered Native American communities who had been making this superfood for centuries. Indigenous peoples had perfected pemmican as a survival food that could sustain hunters and warriors during long journeys. Pirates, always quick to spot a good thing, recognized its potential for sea voyages. The process of making pemmican was deceptively simple, but required precise execution. First, meat, usually deer, bison, or beef, would be dried until it was brittle enough to break. Then came the real work, grinding this dried meat into a fine powder using whatever tools were available. The resulting powder would be mixed with melted animal fat in specific proportions. Some versions included dried berries or fruits, which not only made it slightly more palatable, but also added crucial nutrients. A single pound of pemmican packed around 3,500 calories and could last for years without spoiling. Some pirate vessels carried upwards of 200 pounds of pemmican, enough to feed a crew for several weeks if other supplies ran out. The best part? It didn't need cooking, which made it perfect for times when lighting a fire on ship wasn't possible. Storage was another huge advantage. Unlike salted meat that needed special barrels or dried fish that could get moldy if it got damp, pemmican could survive almost anywhere on the ship. Pirates would stuff it into odd corners, unused spaces, and sometimes even hollow out parts of the ship's structure to hide their emergency pemmican stash. One pirate crew discovered a forgotten cache of 3-year-old pemmican wedged behind some barrel racks, and it was still perfectly edible. The real smart thing about pemmican was its stability in any conditions. Heat didn't phase it, cold made it last even longer, and rough seas couldn't damage something that was already smashed to bits and compressed into a dense mass. In 1728, a barrel of pemmican survived a hull breach while other food stores were ruined by seawater. But this wonder food had its downsides. Eating nothing but pemmican for extended periods could lead to something pirates called the pemmican dreads, a combination of dietary monotony and nutrient deficiency that made crews irritable and sluggish. Smart captains used pemmican as an emergency backup rather than a daily staple, breaking it out during storms or when fresh supplies ran low. The most remarkable thing about pirates' use of pemmican wasn't just that they adopted it, it's how they adapted it. They experimented with different meat sources, fat ratios, and added ingredients based on what they could get their hands on. Some crews even developed their own variations using dried fish or seal meat when land animals weren't available. While pemmican proved to be an invaluable backup food source, pirates knew better than to rely on it entirely. Pemmican was just one piece of a complex food preservation puzzle that kept these seafaring rogues alive in the world's most unforgiving workplace. These preservation methods weren't just about survival, they represented a remarkable fusion of knowledge from cultures around the world. From Native American pemmican to Caribbean smoking techniques, pirates created their own unique blend of food preservation wisdom that sustained their independent life at sea.